Hello, welcome to the Plant Party. Today we're going to talk everything pollinators. This is hosted by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Plant Party is a quarterly webinar series intended for advanced plant training and fun education. I'm Tim Sigmund, the Private Lands Program Leader with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. My co-hosts today are Charles Kniper, State Resource Conservationist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, and Megan Clayton, Professor and Extension Range Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. We have 23 wonderful door prizes today we will be giving away. Our door prize donors today are committed to supporting you in your quest to learn more about plants. I'd like to thank Bamert Seed, InView, formerly Bear Crop Science, Native American Seed Company, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, Texas Brigades, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for donating these prizes.
We'll be moving very quickly through 5 presentations today. Our first presenter today is Beth McMahon. Beth graduated from Texas A&M University in December 2010 with a double major in rangeland ecology and management and horticulture. She interned at the Grand Canyon National Park as a native plant nursery intern before attending Oklahoma State University, where she got her master's working on propagation efforts of the Chickasaw plum. She joined AgriLife Extension, first by working as a research assistant at the AgriLife Extension Viticulture and Fruit Lab, then at the Brazoria County Horticulture as an extension agent before moving to the Gillespie County Horticulture Extension Agent position in 2016, where she currently works. She leads home and commercial horticulture programs, as well as coaching the local 4-H range team. Beth will be presenting on Do Native Plants Need Pollinators? Thank you for kicking off our plant party, Beth.
No problem. As Dr. Clayton said, my name is Beth McMahon, and I am the Gillespie County Horticulture Extension Agent. Now, as a horticulture extension agent, my perspective is more of the plant perspective. So I'm kind of favoring the plants a little bit more here than the pollinators, and this presentation will be geared towards that. So first, how is pollen moved? Well, pollen is moved 4 main ways. One, it could be wind pollen, and we're going to go into more detail about that in a little bit. The second is water. So water can move pollen of many aquatic plants. Then there's insects, as y'all probably all know, but animals are also a mover of pollination as well too. Now here in my part of Texas, we actually don't have that much bat pollination. They need a specific type of flower, but we do have human pollination potentially. So that is when someone will just go in and self-pollinate a flower. It happens with vegetable crops. They're picky, they're needy, whatever. So let's talk about that wind pollination a little bit more. So if a plant is wind pollinated, it technically doesn't need a pollinator. It's just not needed. So wind pollinated plants, their strategy to get that pollen out and to another plant is just to make so much pollen it fills the air, as you can probably see in that cedar video. Their flowering structures also are kind of equipped for that as well too. So if you look down at the picture of the live oak right here, you're going to see that it doesn't have very showy petals. It doesn't have a scent necessarily. It could probably have a scent, but it's not a very strong one that's going to be attracting pollinators. I think it's interesting in its own way. It's very plain, so to say. Its main function is just to release pollen. It's not to draw things in. Our grasses, a lot of them are wind pollinated. And well, I think this is side oats right here in this picture. And I think that actually is quite attractive. It's a pollinator may not necessarily be attracted to it. So it has those stamens. Those are what the red structures are right there. And then it has the stigmas, which is what the feathery structures are right there. And it's pretty simple. I mean, it doesn't have kind of like a nectar guides or anything like that. So these plants technically don't need pollinators. I mean, they're perfectly good on their own. Another example of wind pollinated plants is going to be ash trees. There are elm trees, pecan trees. Kind of think of things that give you allergies. If it gives you an allergy, it's probably wind pollinated. Now, this isn't to say that pollinators or herbivores may not be attracted to these wind-pollinated plants, because these guys are out there, they're looking for pollen. Pecan trees, oak trees, they produce lots of pollen because to be wind pollinated, you have to produce lots of pollen to get it into the air and get it moved to another plant. So they've got the pollen, and if the pollinators are looking for the pollen, well, there they go. There they can find the pollen. But they're not specifically trying to attract them there. Now, that doesn't mean that a pollinator can move pollen from one wind pollinated plant to another wind pollinated plant and it not be helpful. That could be helpful in a way, but it is not the main way that their pollen is moved. Now, I would like you to note a couple of these things. Wine grapes are supposed to be wind pollinated. So seeing a bee on them is a little bit concerning considering the insecticides that they use for them. So that's not really, really common at all, fortunately. But I have noticed that when we have drier springs, when the oak trees or the pecan trees are putting out pollen, you will see bees up there trying to forage and get whatever they can get. So I've been talking about pollination, and from a plant perspective, what exactly is the point of pollination? Because there are some plants out there that can self-pollinate. I mean, why go through all the trouble of producing a lot of pollen if they are wind pollinated? Or why go through all the trouble of making all these pretty flowers, making the nectar guide, if you're trying to get some pollinators to come in? What is the point of this? Well, the point of cross-pollination is genetic diversity. So a lot of plants, they can reproduce asexually, such as like root sprouts, or they can pollinate themselves. So I'm a horticulturist, so I'm going to use a horticulture example, please forgive me, but green beans, for example, they technically don't need pollinators. They will form their own little beans without a pollinator. There are other examples in horticulture. There are cucumbers that will form cucumbers without pollination as well too. So, but for native plants, having that genetic diversity is very key. So let me give an example. Here in the Texas Hill Country, in Gillespie County specifically, especially, we are a oak wilt hotspot. I mean, if you want to see oak wilt, we are the oak wilt capital of Texas. And that's not one of the things that they put on kind of like the tourist brochures. But you go west in the county and there's a lot of dead trees out there. So oak wilt is a fungal disease. It can be spread through spores on open wounds, and it also can move through the roots. And that's kind of the issue. So with the live oaks that we have around here, these live oaks are genetically the same because there's a lot of root sprouts that pop up. And so they're connected to a mother plant. They have the same genetics as the mother plant. So when you have a monoculture that doesn't have a lot of genetic diversity like this, when you have a disease like oak wilt that comes in, it takes out a lot of trees. So that is one of the reasons why we have a lot of oak wilt here in Gillespie County. There is just not a lot of genetic diversity. So if the live oaks were mainly propagated by like acorns or something like that, that would go a long way to helping them have some genetic diversity and maybe fighting off diseases like oak wilt. So genetic diversity is very, very good. So cross-pollination is very, very good. Now, why would a flower do, I mean, it's not like this is amorphizing. Plants don't necessarily choose to do things, but what are the benefits of wind pollination versus nectar pollination? Well, if a plant wants to do wind pollination, with the exception of some grasses, it needs height. So what the little flowers will do instead is they will kind of maximize attracting pollinators to them so that the pollen gets moved that way. Now, I did mention wind pollination first, but about 80% of plant pollination is by pollinators, not necessarily specific pollinators. Pollinator pollination does cost the plants nectar. It does cost the plants energy in making these pretty flowers. Those pretty flowers are not for you. Well, okay, in the horticulture field, we have bred flowers to be pretty, but the native wildflowers, those colors are not bred for you. They are bred to attract insects, sorry, or bugs, or birds, whatever's pollinating them. So potentially there's less pollen needed to make these. And so the nectar could kind of be a trade-off in regards to energy and resources. So it's also good for like a smaller population. They don't need to have like live oaks everywhere to spread that pollen. So a smaller population would be better off that way. Now, what about obligate pollination? So there are very few plants that have to have a specific, or in the case of yucca, 2 specific species to pollinate them. A lot of these pollinators are more generalist, or at least the plants, they can get pollination services from a lot of different things. So they're not really necessarily limited, with a few exceptions. And this is one of the exceptions. So I'm sure all of y'all have seen the beautiful yuccas that we have here. And what happens is the female moth, she will gather balls of pollen, thrust them into the flower of a yucca plant, and then she'll lay her eggs. Now the yucca plant has kind of adapted. It will, if it gets too many moths laying eggs on that so that it cannot reproduce the seeds, it will drop those flowers and everything will die. So the yucca moth has adapted to leave a pheromone tag saying that she has laid her eggs there, the flower has been pollinated, and no other yucca moths will lay their eggs there. So that the yucca moth gets some seeds, the yucca larvae get some seeds to eat, but not everything is eaten. Now, you might be thinking, what about the milkweeds? Ooh, heresy. The milkweeds do not need monarchs. Nope. They get pollination services from other insects and such. So the monarchs may need the milkweeds, but the milkweeds do not need the monarchs for pollination. They can get pollination elsewhere. Now, how are these guys, how are the flowers attracting them? Well, fragrance is one way. Fragrance is, if flower is primarily attracting its pollinators by scent, it's going to have not a very showy flower, so to say, not necessarily, but it is potentially going to have a strong scent, and there's various scents and such. Size, a smaller flower will attract smaller pollinators, a bigger flower will attract bigger pollinators, potentially. Then there's color and pattern. So with the color, that is a picture of a bluebonnet. And it's not just necessarily the colors we see, but it could be UV colors. So if you look at this flower in UV light, which is what the picture is on the right, it has kind of what looks like a target for the pollinator to come in and pollinate the plant. And then there's shape. So this flower right here is not native. This is a whitebrush, this is a cowpin daisy, and that is a bluebonnet. But this one right here is not native. And so the specific size of the flower limits what can push its way in there and push its way out to get the pollination. So I think other speakers might be covering this in detail, which isn't a bad thing, but I'll go over it real briefly. So if you are looking to plant for specific pollinators, moths like night blooming flowers, usually they have kind of like a pale, dull color, but they have a strong scent. And that strong scent is usually released in the evening or like the early morning or going into the night. Bees, they like bright yellow colors, blue colors, and they are attracted to different patterns that will show up potentially in UV light. They like a shallower flower. Beetles, now, this is what attracts specific pollinators. They're going to attract a variety of things. And so with the beetles, if it's something that is primarily beetle pollinated, it's going to be more of like a cup flower and have a specific scent. But beetles aren't picky. This one is attracted to some kind of chicory looking like plant. Birds typically like bright colors, like reds and oranges and such. They can be tubular. They don't necessarily have to be tubular. And when I say tubular, I mean kind of like the snapdragon right here. It has a tube for the flower, for the pollinator to stick its nose in. Butterflies are not super picky. They do need something to land on. They lightly scented, nectar guides, maybe so. And then flies, they aren't really looking for, if something is primarily fly pollinated only, it will have a strong scent that may be unpleasant. And it will be kind of like a reddish color or a dull color. But flies aren't picky. They will go to like yellow flowers. They will go to the pearl milkvine that is pictured here. One final slide before I finish. This is an example of buzz pollination. So plants that are in the Solanaceae family, which is right here, this is silverleaf nightshade, they have pollen structures that require the pollen to be shaken down, whether it's by wind or by bumblebees vibrating the flowers. So if you have garden tomatoes in your garden and such, they could be wind pollinated or they could be buzz pollinated by the bumblebees. Showy partridge pea is another flower. This one is native, and this one can self-pollinate, but it also can be buzz pollinated too to kind of shake that pollen down. If you are interested in some pollinator guides or resources, this probably would have been better putting in like the random chat box, and I will do that. But with that, I am done, and I think I am on time.
Yes, thank you so much, Beth.
Yes.
Remember, everyone, if you have questions for our speakers, type them into the Q&A box. But to continue the theme of pollinators, we invite Craig Hensley with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to discuss feathers, fur, and exoskeletons, the many participants of the pollinator parade. Craig is one of two Texas nature trackers biologists with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. He has been teaching people about nature from Minnesota to Texas, including nearly 9 years at Guadalupe River State Park. His current position provides opportunities to engage Texans on the value and importance of community, citizen science, and documenting the flora and fauna across the state using iNaturalist and other tools. I'll turn it over to you, Craig.
All right, well, we're going to jump right into it. I am part of the community stewardship and engagement team of Texas Nature Trackers within the Wildlife Diversity Division of Texas Parks and Wildlife. And we use iNaturalist as a way to engage people throughout the state of Texas. Some of you on here probably have heard of that. And our idea is to get community scientists, citizen science engaged in helping us track the flora and fauna of the state. That includes 12 projects that we monitor, including ones on bees and wasps of Texas. So a brief overview of pollinators and pollination. There are approximately 4,000 species of native bees in North America. The honeybee, by the way, is not one of them. And pollination began to arise about 140 million years ago. Beetles were likely the first pollinators. About 120 to 130 million years ago, a wasp likely began eating pollen, and then it went on from there. If you had to write a job description for a pollinator, this is what it might look like. So a key responsibility would be to move pollen safely from stamens to pistils. Knowledge, skills, and abilities would include good botanical identification skills, communicate to conspecifics where plants are found, visit flowers when they are shedding pollen, visit flowers of the same species when pistils are receptive, return periodically, annually, and when not possible, provide for offspring that can assume the role, be physically capable of multiple long flights. Hairiness is ideal to help facilitate picking up and dispersing pollen, and you must live in the same community that plants are found. So those to me are a pretty good job description for pollinators. So what's in it for the pollinator? First of all, they get nectar. That's what they're going to use to fly, do their daily activities. That's where they're getting all their carbs. Pollen, of course, contains, they're getting all their energy. Pollen, of course, contains protein, carbohydrates, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. That's food for many. Some flowers provide specialized oils for certain pollinators. And then, of course, certain pollinators, including a lot of bees, actually eat part or break off or chew off parts of the petals and other tissue for either nutrition or for nesting material in many cases. And of course, if you're going to attract pollinators, the pollinators need to be aware that there are always going to be predators lurking amongst those flowers looking for a meal of their own. So when we start looking at who the pollinators are, from the largest number of species all the way down to the lowest, we can start with beetles and then work our way down. It's already been mentioned, some of these groups. We threw in here also ants and reptiles. We'll talk briefly about how that could possibly be. But if we start off with bats, the bats in Texas, we have more than 30 species. 2 of them are specialists of nectar feeding in Texas, the Mexican long-tongued and Mexican long-nosed bats. Of course, bats, just like all mammals, have furry bodies, so they can transport a great deal of pollen when they stick their nose inside those flowers to drink that nectar. The flowers that they are typically visiting open late in the day. They're very fragrant. They produce copious amounts of dilute nectar, not real heavily concentrated sugar-wise. And then, of course, all those great quantities of pollen in order to ensure pollination from flower to flower. Of course, bats can fly long distances. Thus, they are effective at dispersing genetic variation. Most recently, the pallid bats of West Texas have been discovered with pollen on their fur, on their wings, on their noses. And it turns out that they will, along with eating eating invertebrates, they will also feed on the pollen of lechugia flowers in West Texas. So we can add a third to our bat pollination list. When it comes to birds, of course, globally, there are about 50 families of birds that visit flowers. Here in Texas, when we talk about most flower visitors, we're always talking about hummingbirds, but orioles, vireos, warblers will make limited visits to flowers. And just like hummingbirds, it might be seeking insects, and it certainly would be seeking pollen and perhaps even nectar. Our most common species that we have in most of Texas is the black-chinned as a resident species, and the ruby-throated as largely a migratory. Certainly where I live in Bernie, it's a migratory species. Of course, hummingbirds have long bills and long tongues that are specially adapted to slurp up nectar. The nectar flowers, the nectar they feed on, they have varying depths. You can see that photograph there. They'll even drink the nectar out of thistle flowers, but a lot of times they're going to be, of course, red. But I've seen them feed on just about everything in my yard from that, and of every different color of flower. Pollen is primarily accumulated on the outside of the bill and on the forehead, and sometimes on their chest as well, depending on the flower and where the stamens are located when they're feeding on that nectar. When we talk about insect pollinators, we have to look at a lot of different groups here, from the bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths. And they all have their different roles they play. They're all different levels of pollination. Some are better at it, and some are less efficient pollinators. And that's not their primary purpose out there, it seems. We start with beetles, of course, because as I mentioned earlier, they're thought to have become the first pollinators very long time ago. Globally, this number and these numbers, you can debate these numbers all day long, depending on who you talk to, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 350,000 currently known species. That number grows probably every day. Some scientists estimate there could be as many as 1 million different species. In the United States, we have about 30,000 species. A lot of them never feed on flowers. The ones that you often do see at flowers include, not exclusively, but include soldier beetles, longhorn beetles, flower beetles, and a variety of others that you'll see poking around in flowers. And a great place to go see them, by the way, is an open flower of a cactus. They just go crazy inside that. Many of the flower visiting species have hairy lower bodies that can trap pollen grains. Many feed on pollen as they move around it. Some feed on nectar. So they're consuming as well as moving pollen around in some cases. And for beetles, scent is a very important characteristic in locating flowers. They've done experiments where they've been tracking flying beetles, and they go past a flower that's heavily scented, and they literally will stop, turn around, and go right back towards that flower. So that's important. And then a lot of times you'll see beetles attracted specifically to yellow flowers. When we talk about flies, there are so many different flies, 110,000 species. It feels like there must be more when they're in your house. 18,000 in North America alone. There are lots of different flies. Obviously, some visit flowers, some don't, just like the beetles. But bee flies, like you see in the upper right-hand corner, that little fella is a cute little fella, actually. Remember that bees only have 2 wings. So when you see these, a lot of them mimic bees and wasps, but the difference is when you look at their wings, you're only going to see one on either side of the thorax, and then they have a little structure behind the individual wing on either side called a haltere, which is a directional sensing sort of adaptation of a wing. They also often are, and of course the other ones are syrphid flies, hover flies, but they're really quite diverse on flowers of all different kinds. The other thing is a lot of times you'll see, if you've run across flowers that smell bad, there's one up in where I grew up called carrion flower, literally smells like roadkill. And the only thing I ever saw coming to it were flies, thinking that they were going to be able to lay eggs on something. And in the process, they move the pollen. And then there are those types of flowers known as trap flowers, which have a foul smell, attract the fly into the flower and then traps the flower or the bee in there for periods of time. Sometimes it's a few minutes. Sometimes it can be as long as 24 hours, depending on the species of flower. And then, of course, bees are going to be our most common and most closely associated pollinator when it comes to flowering plants. In North America, give or take about 4,000 species, at least 800 in Texas. Most of them will favor yellow or blue or purple flowers, although we all know, I can give you examples, including this video right here, that they are attracted to whatever flowers out there and is carrying around pollen. Although some of them are very specific this is an Alamo vine. This is the only bee in the flowers of Alamo vine that I saw pollinating Alamo vine in my front yard. This species was there all the time, and I didn't see anybody else visiting that particular flower. Most of the adults are short-lived in terms of they may be only out and about for weeks to a couple of months at a time per year. And then the rest of the year, they've made their homes, they've laid their eggs, they've provisioned their larvae, and then they die off, and we don't see that species of bee until the next year. And of course, that as a result of that, some of them are only here for specific times of the year, foraging on specific suite of plants that they are specifically attracted to. Most of our native bees are solitary. They don't collectively guard a hive. They may nest. They may build their nests in a mutually agreeable area, but they're not coordinating their efforts like you see with honeybees. Individual bees can visit thousands of flowers during their lifetime. And one of the fun things to do is when you're studying bees is to look and see how torn up their wings become after short periods of time. And some examples, some of our bees are extremely large, like the carpenter bee. By the way, you can tell a carpenter bee from a bumblebee down here in the lower left-hand corner because they have what's known as a shiny hiney. They don't have any fur on the majority of their abdomen. And then you have the leafcutter bees here that actually collect their pollen on their abdomen. You can see pollen on their hairy legs, but most of the pollen is stored and carried back to their home from their abdomen. They've got hairs hanging down from there. And then as a comparison, this bee right here, this Coletidae, which who knows what species, I don't, is foraging on individual flowers of goldenrod. This is a bee that is about 4 millimeters long. So you can see there's a great deal of variety, and both in shape, look, weight, how they carry pollen, and size. And I want to show you a couple of videos about how different bees collect pollen. This bee is a mason bee. It is a leafcutter bee, so it has the pollen hairs on the bottom of the abdomen. You'll notice it's taking its legs and just sweeping up all kinds of flowers on that Texas thistle, and then pushing the pollen grains onto its abdomen. We look at the bee on the right. This is a tiny little Lasioglossum bee. This is literally a few millimeters long. You can see the little tiny legs with the white pollen that's gathering from these frostweed flowers. Extremely small bee to be able to feed on those individual tube flowers. And then finally, another species of Lasioglossum. And this is kind of a fun one on this thistle, to watch how it just goes to the top of the individual disc flowers where the stamens are coming out. That's the purple that you see there. And then the pistil is coming out from between the stamens, pushing out the pollen grains. And that bee is just taking off those pollen grains and storing them and taking them back to its home. Pretty cool stuff. Then we can turn to wasps, which are the non-hairy versions of bees. They provide all kinds of ecosystem services. Primarily, they are predators for many different kinds of insects, and they grab those insects and then they use that as the food source for their larvae. So they're not actually eating them as adults, but they are using that to supplement what their babies need to eat on. Wasps make up about 15% of flower visiting insects worldwide. It's amazing the diversity of wasps that are feeding on nectar and some on pollen. They do have, some have very specific preferences for different kinds of plants. Some will have shorter tongues, long tongues, and that depends. So that determines what kind of flower they feed on. They will feed on that nectar, again, to get their energy source. And their prey preference is very specific. very valuable. Here are a few examples: the two-spotted blue-winged scullid wasp and the bicolored thinid wasp actually crawl under the soil in your yard looking for those grubs, those beetle grubs that eat your plant roots, and lay an egg on them. And so they're very valuable to have around. They're pretty much harmless if you don't bug them too much. And then you have the Mexican honey wasp that actually does put up some honey and builds a big paper type wasp. In parts of Texas, you got potter wasps that use mud to make their homes. The four-banded stink bug wasp, the great golden digger wasp. All of these are important flower visitors, and more importantly, important predators of insect pests. In terms of butterflies and moths, there are a lot of them out there. There are way more moths than butterflies globally and here in Texas. They are more of incidental pollinators for the most part. They're not really, moths are a little bit more hairy. Skippers are a little bit more scale covered, so they might gather or move more pollen. A lot of the pollen that these critters are going to move are going to be from their proboscis. The pollen grains get stuck on the proboscis or perhaps on their feet, less so on their body like you see with bees. And just to kind of show you how that works, here's a little video of a white-winged sphinx moth. And the thing to look for when it moves to the next set of flowers, I know this is pretty loud, is you'll see yellow on the, there it is, yellow on the proboscis. So that gives you an idea that that's where they're moving that pollen around on those hill country penstemons. Here are just a few examples. Again, when you look at how they fit on a flower, their feet are way up here, their bodies, for the most part, away from the flower. So again, it's going to be incidental pollination that happens with most of our butterflies for sure. And then, of course, there are ants and there are lizards that I had on that list. Ants really aren't as much about seed or pollination as they are about seed transport, scarification of seeds, and of course, soil tilling. They actually move more soil than even worms do, according to some researchers. And then in terms of lizards, most of us don't think of lizards running around pollinating on flowers, but apparently on some oceanic islands, they actually do carry pollen around on their snouts. And they too help by spreading seeds and through scarification of those seeds, by eating them and passing them through their body. So that's a big coverage of a lot of stuff there. I want to end with this video right here. This is a plant called marble seed. The flowers hang upside down. They're white. They're not real attractive looking to us humans probably, but it's a great plant to demonstrate two forms of pollination. One is that they have the insect pollination from this queen bumblebee, blooms in the spring, by the way. And then you'll notice that there's a little stem sticking out of the flower. That's the pistil that's exerted outside the flower. The stamens are around the inside of the tube. The female has to stick her head through the opening, and in the process moves a lot of pollen around. So if you'll watch, you're going to see that her belly, the belly of her abdomen, is going to pick up a lot of pollen as pollen grains fall out of the flower. So, and as she moves around, then her belly of her abdomen is going to come in contact with the pistils of other flowers as you see her move from one flower to another. And that's going to create pollination opportunities. But then keep watching, and you're going to start to see some powder floating through the air. It's going to look like little gold tiny dots here very soon. Very soon. There we go. Here it comes. Right there, right there. You can actually see that pollen is falling out of the flower, and then it's also moving, that pollen's moving by wind. So here's an example of both animal pollination and wind pollination. And the reason I say wind pollination is because those pollen grains floating through the air might actually hit one of those exerted pistils on the other flowers. So pretty cool adaptation for the plant, marble seed or false Cromwell, and certainly makes the bumblebee there. Look at all that flying around. Makes the bumblebee a very effective pollinator. So that's what I have for you this morning. I could go on and on and on, frequently do, but today I will end right there.
Next up, we have Carol Clark, who will speak on honeybees versus native bees. Do we really need both? Carol is an amateur botany enthusiast, a Texas master naturalist, a longtime member of the Native Plant Society of Texas, and a conservation specialist with Monarch Watch. She co-administrates the Texas Native Bee Co-op Facebook page and chairs the Bring Back the Monarchs to Texas Committee for the Native Plant Society of Texas. She and her husband own and operate Clark Haven Farm, a wildlife preserve and custom wildflower seed business in Cook County. Carol has spent much of her life looking around and learning in the great outdoors. Her favorite things to do are leading discovery walks in local nature areas and finding and photographing interesting plants and insects. Welcome to Plant Party, Carol. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming. We only have 15 minutes, so we're going to dive right in. So native bees versus honeybees. Do we really need both of those things? Let's see if I can get this working. All bees, honeybees and native bees, share some features. They have antennae, large compound eyes, a thorax, 4 wings, 6 legs, and an abdomen. You know, they're relatives. Bees, wasps, and ants, super similar and very closely related. Craig covered some of this already. Bees are considered vegetarians. They collect nectar and pollen for their young, while wasps will eat more meaty items like spiders and caterpillars. However, recent research has shown that there are some tiny creatures and also some fungi within their nectar supply. So they're actually eating some micromeat as they consume these tiny organisms. Bees have a couple of kinds of ways that they could collect pollen, which they do for their offspring. Specialized hairs called scopae and corbiculae, which are little scoops on their hind legs. You can see the bumblebee on the bottom left has wet orange pollen packed into her corbicula there. And that is how they would carry the wet pollen. The branched hairs generally carry dry pollen. So how are our bees doing? Not well at all. You've probably heard of colony collapse disorder, and honeybees are still having trouble. Researchers are thinking it's a combination of a lot of things, maybe pesticides, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation. Pesticides can combine with diseases and parasites to make the bees maybe not be able to resist things that they used to. So they're getting sicker and hives are collapsing. Diet is also a possible problem because honeybees have been commercialized. They get moved to go visit a crop that is one item. It's just canola or it's just almonds. And so the bees are having a restricted diet in a lot of cases instead of a wide-ranging diet. A lot of our native bees are in big trouble too. And this is a little bit harder to quantify. Some species of native bees are now gone from big swaths of the country where they used to be found. We know they were common there, and now you can't find them at all, or you can hardly find them. One of those that has had its range severely restricted is the American bumblebee, this young lady right here. So should you get a beehive to help save the bees? My answer is no. And here's why. Honeybees are not native to Texas. They're not even native to North America. So a honeybee is to a native bee like a chicken is to a chickadee. And you wouldn't say, I think I'm going to start backyard chickens to save the birds. Honeybees, again, only arrived on this continent with the Europeans. And even if you see a hive living in the wild, that is a feral hive or a wild hive, but still not a native hive of honeybees. Honeybees have been domesticated and tended for a very long time by humans. And like pigs, you might best think of these as domestic livestock that escapes captivity sometimes. Another thing about honeybees is if you decide to get into backyard beekeeping as a way to save the bees, you might actually be doing honeybee populations more harm than good. Because if you're not very skilled at it, your hive may harbor diseases and parasites that then get spread to commercial populations of honeybees and native bees as well. All right, we talked about them escaping. This is a hive in the process of escaping. It is either a hive that has split into two hives, or it is a population of bees that have been kept in a box somewhere by a beekeeper that's decided something's wrong with their current living quarters and they want to move to a new one. The queen will be someplace in that ball of bees while scouts go out to look for a new living space. And if you see this, it's definitely honeybees. None of our native bees do this. So to help with bee problems, beekeepers of honeybees can do all kinds of management things in response. They can create new hives and multiply their holdings by splitting a hive or introducing a queen and giving her some worker bees so that they can multiply their hives. And they do that at a pace that keeps up with honeybee losses. They can feed their hives, clean their hives, medicate their hives, adjust the genetics if there are behavior issues by re-queening a hive. They can ship hives across country to fields that are blooming. So there are actually more honeybee hives now in the US than there have ever been. And you hear about these losses. Yes, we're losing a lot of honeybees every year, but they're being replaced by management. Native bees, though, can also be farm workers, and there are a few native bees that are managed by humans. We've got alfalfa leafcutter bees, and of course, they work on alfalfa crops. Bumblebees are used for greenhouse tomatoes. Alkali bees have been found to be super important to alfalfa crops in certain areas. And now you can actually get a guide if you're in Utah on creating an alkali bee bed that's just right for them to nest in. Orchard and mason bees can be important to fruit production, and they can be managed by humans in boxes provided for them. But most native bees remain completely unmanaged by humans. Not necessarily a bad thing. One of the reasons is there's probably more native bee species than you think. And Craig mentioned the 800 number, but it is a little old. And so by some estimates, we think there are up to 1,500 species of native bees in Texas, and only a very few imported species. Our native bees can be huge, like our bumblebees, or they can be really tiny. This little bristle sweat bee is barely over 1/8 of an inch long. It's extremely tiny, and it's not our smallest native bee. So there they are, super tiny. This one, a different Lasioglossum bee, does not come up over the edge of a dime that I posed it with. Native bees can also be more versatile than honeybees. They can do things that honeybees simply can't do. They can be active in lower temperatures than honeybees can tolerate. And that's not all native bees, but some native bees. So you'll see some working in early February, for instance. Some of them can forage in higher temperatures than honeybees can tolerate. The larger ones can fly further than honeybees can. And some can buzz pollinate like the bumblebees that Craig was talking about. Some have unusual shapes or sizes that exactly fit our flower features. You can see that carpenter bee on the right is having its back brushed with pollen, and the stamens are right there, and the pistils are right there to have that pollen transferred. If a honeybee were to visit that same flower, it could climb in and it could drink the nectar that's down below, but its back would not brush those reproductive parts. And so this plant really needs a very large bee to pollinate it. The overwhelming majority of our native bees are solitary nesting species. As Craig said, they may form aggregations, but those are not true cooperative colonies. They don't share chores. So a single solitary nesting bee will provision her own nest site. The males don't help with this, and she will lay as few as 12 to 14 eggs in her entire lifetime. So not a lot of eggs. What do they look like? Well, there are these adorable little megachile bees, the leaf cutters that Craig was talking about. Here's a male and a female. He gets all the beautiful colors. She gets these giant jaws, and she's going to cut little leaf circles or flower petal circles out with those jaws. You can tell when they've been there because your plants are going to look like they've been shot with pellets. And she'll take those little circles, roll them up, form a tube, and tuck that tube into some place. She actually creates it in place, just some little hiding place, which can be a narrow tube or a little inaccessible space. This is a nest block that's been provided for them, and some of those holes have chewed up end caps of chewed up leaves. And those are the ones that the leafcutter bees have occupied. Some others are occupied by mason bees or mason wasps. There's an aggregation of ground nesting bees and one individual nest site of a ground nesting bee. This is Diodacia afflicta. So we only have a very few bee species that are truly social in Texas, and they're typically looking for a ready-made cavity for the entire colony to live in. So a big hole in a tree or a box or underground. Honeybees and bumblebees both have this very complicated social lifestyle with queens, workers, and different jobs for different bees in the colony. But bumblebee colonies are different. They only last 1 year, and only the queen overwinters by herself. There's some of our native bumblebees. How about the economics of bees? They're super important to agricultural production, and about 2/3 of our fruit and vegetable crops depend on bees. Those wind-pollinated crops tend to be our grain crops, and they're not so dependent. Blue orchard bees, though, are great at pollinating fruit trees, which bloom earlier in the spring, just when these blue orchard bees are out. So why do we need the native bees versus the honeybees? Well, they can be up to 200 times as effective at pollinating certain items. And it's not just the native bees or the native plants, but also some of our food crops. We have squash bees that excel at pollinating squash blossoms. Our native bees are all built differently. Some have long tongues or long legs, some have short tongues. And without the right pollinators, certain plants simply can't reproduce. Those buzz pollinators are very important to things in the tomato family. Here is one of those wild plants in the tomato family being buzz pollinated. We also have specialist interaction. Some bees are so closely tied to some species of plants that there's literally one species in their range that they can use. This is an oil bee, a centrus bee, and it is scraping oils from a chromaria flower that are needed to complete its reproductive cycle. And if we lose our specialist bees due to pesticides or other interference, we will lose these specialty plants that really probably aren't effectively pollinated by other things. Those losses of species will work our way up the food chain until that gets to us, and eventually maybe make it hard for us to survive as one species after another of both insects and other animals and plants wink out. There's another specialist bee that in my neck of the woods has exactly one plant it can use. This is the spring beauty bee, which uses only the pollen from spring beauties for its offspring. It can't change to another plant. Cactus bees, we have all kinds of other bees that are specialists or extremely narrow specialists. Cactus bees can sometimes use wine cups, or just cactus or just wine cups, depending on the species. So what do they need from us? They need habitat. They need diverse food sources. Our native bees need all kinds of plants for nectar and pollen, even some that we don't think are very important. They need water. If you're providing a water source for bees, include a stick or a rock so they don't get stuck and drown. And they need nesting sites and materials. So for some of our native bees, that's simply hollow stems that we need to keep. They also need protection from pesticides and protection from mechanical disturbance. If you're chopping up all your hollow stems every year on whatever yard or acreage you manage, you're probably destroying a lot of native bees that are overwintering as larvae in those stems. About 70% of our bees are nesters, ground nesters that live in holes in the ground that they make. And about 30% are tube nesters that need little tunnels in stalks or other places that they can access, like old beetle holes. Just a very few are cavity nesters, like our bumblebees. It's just a few examples of some nest sites. Some nest sites made by people for bees can be very elaborate and can be put in public places like a park. And you might wonder, is that safe? Well, yes, it is, because our native bees do not defend these solitary nest sites. Bumblebees, remember, have a whole colony, and they will vigorously defend their site. But solitary bees don't. The risk to them and to their brood is too high. They prefer to leave. Even if they chose to defend their nest site, many of them don't have stingers that can penetrate your skin. And if they did, their venom is a very different quality from honeybees. Honeybees have venom that is made to irritate mammals because they make honey. Since our native bees don't, they don't usually have to defend against mammals, and their stings are not irritating. The only native bee allergies that are known are in people who work with bumblebees commercially and have been stung multiple times by bumblebees. So how can you help? Plant lots of different plants for pollen and nectar. Choose old-fashioned versions with simple centers that bees can access. Use few or no pesticides. If you have to use a pesticide, always use it exactly as directed. Provide those nest sites or leave those nest sites in place without disturbance. Wait for bumblebees to go dormant before you mow your clump grasses or pastures if possible. And then snap photos and document your native bees so we can begin to understand their distributions better. Okay, so I am probably out of time at this time. I think I haven't checked, and I think we'll wrap it up. But I'm just going to go through a few photos of our lovely native bees without comment to let you know that they come in lots of shapes and sizes and colors, and they deserve our respect. Can we get along without honeybees? Maybe not in our current state of agriculture, but we certainly cannot get along without our native bees, and we need to know that. So I hope you all found some new things to learn today, and I think I'm going to wrap it up there.
Thanks for the great presentation, Carol. That was really good.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate that. So we'll move right into our next presentation on herbicides and pollinators and how they can coexist with Dr. Ray Moranz. Dr. Moranz is a grazing lands pollinator ecologist for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Ray also serves as a partner biologist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service and assists the Central National Technology Support Center in Fort Worth, Texas, with pollinator conservation throughout the central U.S. Ray began studying grassland plant and butterfly communities in 2004 and earned his PhD in Natural Resource Ecology and Management from Oklahoma State University in 2010. Prior to that, Ray worked for the Nature Conservancy in Florida and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in California. Ray, his wife, and 2 children live on a poultry and pollinator ranch just outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma. I'll turn it over to you, Ray, and take us away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, I guess it is, where you are. I'm on vacation in North Florida, having a Florida plant party, searching for monarch butterflies and the plants they utilize here, but happy to talk to you folks in Texas about herbicides and pollinators and how they can coexist. I want to introduce you briefly to the organization I work for, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We were created about 52 years ago by people who love butterflies, bees, and other invertebrates, like spiders and crayfish, and wanted to make sure that none of them go extinct. The beautiful little blue butterfly shown on the left, the Xerces blue, was driven to extinction in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1940s. And that inspired people to say, hey, let's keep that from happening again. The Xerces Society pays my salary, but they pay me to assist the USDA NRCS accomplish their mission. And their mission, of course, is to deliver conservation solutions to farmers and ranchers so that they can feed the world, but also protect natural resources, including pollinators. Well, what is my role with Xerces and NRCS? It's really to help farmers and ranchers and gardeners and the general public maintain spaces for pollinators to thrive. And prehistorically, it was pretty easy for pollinators to thrive. Pollinators need food, shelter, and a clean environment, and all of these things were available in abundance. And I would argue that in this site that you can see here, this beautiful grazed rangeland in northern Oklahoma, plenty of food, plenty of shelter, and a pretty good environment, pretty clean. And an example I'll bring up for a pollinator, of course, is one that's highly recognized, the monarch butterfly. With its host plants, monarchs shown on the left lay their eggs only on milkweeds. In this case, the eggs are laid on sandhill milkweed. That I took these photos in Florida on Friday, and you can see the larvae on the right. The larvae have to eat milkweed. There's nothing else they like. The adults, of course, nectar at a variety of flowers that do occur in Texas. Tall thistle on the left, goldenrod in the middle, and golden crown beard, also known as cowpen daisy on the right, and many other things. Unfortunately, herbicides have killed milkweeds and nectar plants and the host plants of other butterflies and the food sources of other bees and butterflies. They've killed hundreds of millions of milkweeds, maybe even billions. It's a big deal. This map shows the distribution of the use of one very commonly used herbicide, glyphosate. Glyphosate is a general herbicide. It kills lots of different species of plants. And as you can see, it's used fairly heavily in parts of Texas, but really quite heavily in the corn belt of the Midwest. That happened to be probably the most important part of the country for monarch production, for monarch breeding. And if we look at these graphics on the left, showing how glyphosate use has increased enormously since the 1990s. By the way, it has leveled off somewhat in the last 13 years, but it increased through the 90s and the early 2000s. As glyphosate use in cropland was increasing, the egg production of monarchs, shown on the right, that egg production was decreasing. So this is thought by many monarch biologists to be the most important factor, or a very important factor, in the decline of the monarch butterfly. In addition to killing milkweeds or other nectar plants, other host plants, herbicides can have non-lethal effects. They can stunt their growth. They can delay flowering, and all those can be problematic for pollinators. So now I want to talk, instead of just talking about the plants, talk about the direct effects of herbicides on insect pollinators. What do we know about the toxicity to pollinators? Unfortunately, the research is still fairly limited. Research on insecticides is even limited, but research on herbicides, pesticides that kill plants, that's even harder to find. Typically, the research has been done is standard acute toxicity testing on honeybees. They drop a little bit of an herbicide on a bee and see if it kills it or not. Most research has been done with only a very small set of herbicides. Many herbicides are largely unresearched, therefore, and there has been little research on sublethal effects. Sublethal effects include things like impaired navigation. The bees have a harder time finding their way home, finding their way to a flower, finding their way back to the nest. Another indirect effect is a change in the gut microbiome. It influences the bacterial flora inside the gut, makes digestion more difficult for the bee or butterfly. Also, herbicides can impact brood development, the production of young. It can result in reduced size of young, delayed molting, reduced survival of the young. Major problems. So one very important thing to consider to try to mitigate the negative effects of pesticides, and this term mitigation is extremely, means reducing. It means lessening the impact. It's a very important principle in multiple NRCS documents on the topic. NRCS, USDA NRCS clearly wants agricultural producers to try to mitigate the impacts of herbicides. NRCS understands that insecticides and herbicides will often be necessary to have a revenue-producing crop, a profitable crop. But if possible, we want to reduce that risk. And to reduce that risk, you try to use compounds that are less toxic and expose the organisms to the compounds less. If you have a highly toxic compound, but there's no exposure, there's no risk. So let's try to reduce toxicity and exposure. Now, switching from talking about cropland to land managers, where do herbicides fit in for land managers? Well, land managers like me, we manage invasive species, or we might use herbicides to prepare areas for restoration. However, in all of these cases, caution is a good idea because herbicides, of course, can have negative effects. So, one very important principle is to consider using an integrated vegetation management plan with the least harmful methods. And another very important principle is monitoring and early detection of invasive exotic plants. If you're in a region, I used to work in the Florida Panhandle, and I worked there at a time when it didn't have that many exotic plants, I'm happy to say, and I started treating them back then. I left the area, but people have continued to the work, and it's still in pretty good shape. That monitoring and early intervention is key. What are things we can do to manage weeds in a more environmentally friendly way? We can try to prevent their occurrence in the first place. Limit soil disturbance when you can. If you do a management activity like create a fire line, a burn boundary, if you create a burn boundary via disking or plowing, consider reseeding the area so that weed seeds won't be able to dominate the spot. Clean your equipment and your clothing, and please consider using weed-free soil and materials if you add soil and other items. Mechanical and cultural control can be important. Now, flower head removal, obviously that's usually going to be most valuable in a small setting like a garden. But even on an acreage, if you don't have the means right now to kill the plants, but you have a tool like a weed whacker that you could go out and chop off all the flower heads. Go out and chop off all the flower heads so that you'll prevent seed production of those weeds. Hand pulling or digging are obviously organic methods of managing weeds, as is mowing, tilling, and prescribed burning. Where you do use herbicides, of course, mitigate risk wherever you can. Try to select the least toxic options. And the University of California's IPM Center has produced a bee precaution tool to let us know the toxicity level of various pesticides. Of course, treat only the area needed. This fellow here has a backpack sprayer on. He is spot spraying. That's such an important methodology. It's something I do on our farm. I spot spray herbicides to control invasive exotics like old world bluestem. Also, target your applications at the most effective time, at the time when that plant is most vulnerable to being sprayed, and avoid applying herbicides to flowering plants. If you apply them to flowering plants while they're flowering, that's also the time when pollinators are visiting them. So you If you spray at that time, you're increasing the likelihood that the pollinators will have exposure to those chemicals. We don't want to do that. Another big use by some for herbicides is site preparation for pollinator methods. Some various methods include on the left, solarization, covering the ground with plastic to heat the soil and kill the weed seeds and weed seedlings. However, that's got an environmental problem, plastic waste, including microplastics. In the middle, we see tillage. That's a way to help you control weeds before you plant native wildflowers. However, tillage has its problems, helps get rid of organic matter in the soil, especially if you do it a lot. On the right, herbicides can be effective, but of course, they can have indirect and direct effects on pollinators. Another method, or an organic method, that you might not have heard of is smother cropping. Smother cropping, the idea behind smother cropping, you plant a good plant in really, really high density so that it outcompetes any weed seeds that come up, that germinate and send up weed seedlings. And those smother crops can provide forage for pollinators in the meantime. But the point down below, I want to emphasize a strict timeline must be followed. You need to kill your cover crop, your smother crop, before it sets seeds, or it'll become your new weed. This slide, I think, is very important. It shows the importance of site prep. On the top, we have a site that's been site prepped pretty well. There just aren't any weeds. After they site prepped, they planted a wildflower mix. In year 1, we have some good flowers. In year 2, it's looking terrific. In year 3, it's looking even better, higher diversity. On the bottom, you have a site where the weeds were not controlled. And that means in year 1 and year 2, the weeds dominate. And the natives that got planted, the native wildflowers got planted, never really made it. I want to show you 2 sites from our farm. And I will say that I chose to use herbicides to control the Bermuda grass and then plant native wildflowers. That was my personal decision. I'm not endorsing that. Of course, I don't know the effect. I don't know the negative effects that those herbicides had on the soil flora or on organisms. I will say the site has loads of pollinators now. And here it is again last summer. I want to acknowledge the help I received from my coworker, Emily May, who created many of the slides in this presentation. She is a pesticide expert. She's on our pesticide team. Consider reaching out to her at emily.may@xerces.org if you have questions about specific herbicides. But of course, you're always welcome to contact me. We have a whole bunch of publications at our website on pesticides. Our website is xerces.org. We have many other publications on pollinators and invertebrates, but a whole bunch on pesticides. The NRCS has this extremely important tech note, agronomy tech note number 9, about how to mitigate the negative impacts of pesticides on pollinators. Once again, agronomy tech note number 9. Strongly recommended. Here's my contact info if you want to reach out to me. And thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moranz. That was an excellent presentation. We're ready to get our last presentation started. Our final speaker is Ed Henry, the National Ecologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Ed has 30 years of experience in the conservation field at the national and federal level. His current job duties include biodiversity, pollinators, invertebrate habitats, invasive species and ecology, and indigenous ecological knowledge. In addition to working for the USDA NRCS, he has also worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a refuge manager and as a ranger for the National Park Service. Ed is also the author of 4 natural history and hiking books and an avid hiker, photographer, and explorer of the planet and its natural systems. Today, Ed will be speaking about monarchs, milkweeds, and migrations. Thanks for being with us today, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time this morning. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about monarchs, milkweeds, and migrations. We're going to talk about some monarch ecology and talk a little bit about how Texas kind of fits into that, some Texas plants, and we're going to talk about some status and big picture of monarchs as well. So why do we love monarch butterflies? I mean, why do they matter? And I think a lot of it has to do with the values that we admire in monarchs. They're attractive, they're free, they're carefree, they're resilient. And look at what they do. They're overachievers. They migrate thousands of miles from Canada to Mexico, and they're really found throughout most of the United States. They're beloved by us as children, and we learn about that, and it sticks with a lot of us. So it's kind of a cultural part, a cultural learning that we all share. They're also an indicator species. They are a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, in terms of what's going on over the big picture in our ecosystems, and help us to ask questions about what might be going wrong. Monarchs are ecologically fascinating. And some of the things that are just amazing about monarchs, and we're going to come back to some of these and talk about them, is just how they have such concentrated winter habitat in Mexico and how they live there. The overwintering generation that lives nearly a year, and then they migrate north and laying those eggs, and just how they cycle. It's really an amazing thing when you think about 4 to 5 generations moving, gathering energy, reproducing, moving again, gathering more energy, and doing the same thing again and again. That is such a complex ecological and energy cycle that I think it is worthy of our attention and really awe. As we all know, caterpillars feed exclusively on milkweed. And it's been mentioned before today, and it's another one of those things to think about. It's just how dependent monarchs are on milkweed. But the milkweeds actually are not dependent on monarchs at all. Yeah, monarchs do some pollinating, but the milkweeds would get along just fine. So it's kind of an example of commensalism, which sometimes is hard to find, where one species really benefits and the other isn't helped or harmed by the species being there. So adults, they live on nectar and water, and that's it. So, and also butterflies, once they've gathered enough energy, we talked about how they move through their cycles. And one of my favorite terms is a super generation. That's the last one. They're a little bigger. And those are the guys and gals that move back to Mexico and really kind of complete the cycle. So as talking a little bit more about that life cycle, so they go from egg to adult in as little as 25 days. Each egg is laid individually. 5 instars to the caterpillar. And as you can see here, it talks about how it's really the instars 2 through 5 that have those colored bands that we see in monarchs. So a little bit about the pupa. They mature in 8 to 15 days. Adults lived on nectar from a variety of plants. And after 4 to 5 generations, that last generation, the super generation, they go back to the Oyamel firs, or the sacred firs of Mexico. Great name for the species. And the habitat they need on the way north is not the same as what they need on the way south. So milkweeds are absolutely necessary as they go north. Milkweeds, not so much, but it's really just the nectar, water, places to roost on going back south. So why do monarchs taste bad? We all talk about it. We know about that, but what's going on there? And it's because of something called cardenolides, and they have a strong bitter taste to most animal life. And monarch caterpillars, though, they love the stuff and they can concentrate it. And that's what really gives them the ability to not get eaten en masse. And so what are these cardenolides? And they're cardiac glycosides, and it's related to a poison and a medicine. So, and it can be used to regulate the sodium-potassium balance in the heart. But the overuse of those drugs can, and it does, if overused, lead to poisoning. So, and this also can cause vomiting in birds, can cause vomiting in humans too. And if absorbed by the birds, it could be lethal. That's why we throw it up. And birds must learn this avoidance. It's not instinctive. So that means some of the butterflies, they have to sacrifice themselves to save the others. It really is a community species survival, not unlike honeybees and that social organization, not as complex at the social level, but that's really what's going on with butterflies. And that's why these monarchs taste bad. So monarch migrations, what's going on there? Where are they moving? It's amazing with these thousands of miles, and where are they going? There's 2 main flyways in the US. The Western flyway, it's mostly isolated. They winter in California. They go back and forth. They go up into Idaho and a little bit north, but they stay out in the Western United States. Then there's a much bigger, wider flyway with much larger numbers, although both have significantly declined, that go through the central US and into the eastern US. There's also some resident non-migratory populations in Florida, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands within the United States. The populations do mix a little bit, but scientists really don't know exactly how much. We just know that there is some mixing. So even as the Western populations get rather sparse, some of the ones coming up from Mexico may head on over there. So we may see some changes in those migration patterns. So the habitat in Mexico is really small, really critical. We talked about the OML firs, those sacred firs. It's west of Mexico City. Ecotourism is on the rise there. It's now that most of the area is a designated international biosphere reserve. So it is something I'd love to go down there and do that. Maybe if there's a door prize with the plant party to take an eco tour down to the OML firs, let me know. I'll definitely sign up for that. So why is Texas an important monarch state? And it's really about location, location, location. You know, Texas is kind of the Tiffany location for these monarchs. They're funneled through the central and eastern part of the flyway, comes through Texas. And it's a critical part of those first and second generation life cycle. And there's something called the I-35 Monarch Highway. So, you know, I-35 is the way that these monarchs happen to follow, or actually the other way around, I guess. And there's actually been a book written, I can't remember the author's name offhand, but about somebody who actually biked the journey up along with the monarchs following that I-35 corridor in general. And it really is an amazing journey that these monarchs have. And it is so central to the United States and up into Canada and what we do. So in Texas, it's April and March that are the peak times for monarchs coming through. So what are some of the important milkweeds and nectar plants for monarchs in Texas? I mean, if we want to plant plants in, zipping on through. In Texas, you know, what is it that we can plant? And some of those species include the green milkweed, antelope horn, zezote, world, and the white or Texas milkweed. And those are some of the ones, a lot of them are drought resistant. They can handle the sun. Some of them can handle a slight amount of shade, but these are really good plants for the monarchs going north. If you're thinking about planting common milkweed, of course, is another one that you can use as well. But coming south, or when the butterflies are really looking for nectar, butterfly bush, mule flat, desert bloom, button bush, or some other examples that you can plant as well. The USDA plants database, and that is an acronym as well. And you can see the website that's up there. I'll try to get that posted in the chat after I'm done talking. There's another place you can go to learn more about plants, their ranges, and a little bit more about them. So milkweed economics. You know, milkweed is an interesting plant in that it was often seen as a weed, but now it's also gaining much, much more acceptance as it's part of our beloved monarch cycle. And it's also being seen as a beneficial wildlife plant and even a potential row crop. You can see this journal from the Wall Street Journal, and the fuzz, the fluff, it can be used to stuff things like vests and provide insulation. So the seed can sell for about $120 a pound, and you need about 6 pounds per acre if you want to plant milkweeds as a row crop. So talked about a little bit about the floss and where it was used. And I think the coolest part is in World War II, when we weren't able to get the fibers we needed from East Asia because of the war with Japan, the floss was used to fill life jackets, and it would float for, I think, up to 18 hours, or maybe up to a little bit longer than that even, for folks at sea who needed them. So it can be a modern replacement for synthetic fibers. A bit of research going into that to stop using with the petroleum and some of the other manufactured fibers, that the milkweed may be something that can be used as a substitute. So milkweed, as we talked about, is a valuable nectar plant for honeybees and bumblebees as well, many other species too. So, and per acre, milkweed plants can really support between about 15 and 450, 500 monarchs. So it really depends on the concentration and what's going on, where you are, the climate conditions, the amount of water, etc. So, and also in a survey that was done, that monarchs were valued by the American people about $5 billion in economic output. So while that's not huge in terms of the economy as a whole, it's still a lot. And it shows that Americans do think about and do value monarch butterflies. So another thing about planting monarchs and what's going on with them and something to think about is tropical monarch or milkweeds. And why are they controversial? And there's quite a bit of reason for that. And part of it is because the tropical milkweeds hang around all year. And it can actually entice the monarchs to stay around all year, kind of like the Canada goose or geese of the butterfly world. So they lose their ability to migrate. The individuals become smaller, the disease is easier to pass around. So that's one of the problems with tropical milkweed. And that if you are going to use it, you got to cut it back so that the monarchs aren't enticed to stay around and to override their instinct to migrate because there is such a tasty buffet just waiting for them. So it also can trick them into laying their eggs at the wrong time. And the tropical milkweeds that we talked about, they don't die back. So if you are going to have them or you see them, cut them back. That will help the monarchs. It can also, tropical milkweeds, because they don't die back, can harbor diseases for longer. So that's something else to think about in terms of using tropical milkweeds. So, and their persistence can also crowd out native annual and perennial species, including other milkweeds, which we would definitely prefer because those are the things that have evolved with our landscape here in North America. So a little bit about NRCS and what we can do. We use our 9 steps of planning. We have resource concerns, identified inadequate wildlife habitat, poor plant health and productivity, and NRCS can help at our USDA Service Center. Visit us and we'll be able to help you out. We can apply things like our 420 wildlife planting standard, our 327 conservation cover. We can plan those, we can provide funding for those under many circumstances, and really, help people help the land, which is what the agency, one of the agency's really philosophies and visions are. We have farm bill programs, including CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, through Farm Service Agency, EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, Conservation Steward Program as well, that we can use to help out. So again, visit your USDA Service Center. We have one in almost every county, and we'll be able to help you out with this information and more with planning and potential implementation as well. So status, a little bit about the status, climate change and monarchs. You can see the graphs. They show the numbers. On the left is in the orange is the eastern monarch population, and the green is the western. Notice the magnitudes of differences, but that decline is definitely there. And one of the things that's interesting in the western one, you can see the number of sites that have been monitored. Even as we're monitoring more sites, we're not really finding a lot more monarchs in the west. We've identified the locations where they are. It's really about stewardship and what we can do. So you can see a little bit more. We also, there's problems not just here in North America, but in Central America, in Mexico, and with those sacred firs and what's going on in their populations and their higher elevations and what's going on with them with climate change as well. Changes in milkweed blooming is also affecting the monarchs, and they need to adjust to that like many other wildlife species. I'm going to leave you with a few other interesting facts about monarchs. They are native to North America, but there are populations in other parts of the world. They're not really considered invasive, but they are certainly present, and it's something to think about. We talked about honeybees earlier in the talk about being from another part of the world. And of course, they integrate a lot with those crops that are from another part of the world, but monarchs find themselves in other parts of the world as well. The Iberian Peninsula, Australia, Southeast Asia, Central and South America. So also, one of the other things I find really interesting is the monarch and the viceroy. Showed you a couple picture here. You can look for that stripe on its lower wing in the viceroy. That's the main difference, the first and easiest way to tell the difference. Viceroys, which we generally don't think of as tasting so bad to birds, but it turns out there's some studies that show with the willows that the viceroys tend to eat, they may not taste so great either. So it may be more about convergent evolution, not just mimicry. So the monarchs we talked about can fly thousands of miles. They have some known up to 3,000 miles. And we talked about those sacred firs, the Oyamel fir forest. They're not tropical at all. I think that's important to think about. We think of Mexico and many times, oh, it's in the tropics. It's all hot and warm. Well, the Oyamel firs, they're not. It's really about arresting a hibernation type state for the monarchs, 7,000 to 13,500 feet, and they can survive into plant hardiness zone 8. They're actually having to move up, and they're running out of habitat in Mexico with changes in climate change. The monarchs themselves, they're overwintering around 10,000 feet in elevation. 32 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit is optimal for them. Lower than that, they have to burn their fat to stay warm. Hotter than that, they often will die out as well. So a lot going on there with our monarchs. So anyway, I just wanted to wrap up and say thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions. So with that, I will say thank you very much and turn it back over to our host, and then we can wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. That was a great presentation on monarchs. And thanks again to all the door prize sponsors: Bambert Seed, InView, Native American Seed, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, Texas Brigades, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We appreciate your support of the Plant Party. Thanks to all of you and to our speakers for attending our 10th Plant Party webinar. Again, Plant Party is a quarterly advanced plant webinar training series brought to you by the USDA NRCS, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and we will be sending a link to a short survey by email, or you can type in the address you see on the screen in the chat box, or we'll pop up the QR code here in a second that you can simply hold your phone camera over and click on the link that pops up. So the next Plant Party, if you want to put it in your calendar, will be on June 28th, and we're going to be talking about wetlands. So talking wetlands is our topic for the next Plant Party on June 28th. So bring your learning cap for some soggy fun. We will send an email with more information to all the past registrants as we get closer. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you next time.